place at the end of lap 1, comes home to win the Sakir Grand Prix.
This is how we do it, man. We shut our mouth and we work hard.
The 2023 F1 season was dominated by Red Bull, even though only one of their drivers seemed unstoppable. While Max Verstappen broke record after record, his teammate Sergio Perez had a very different story. Some call him the perfect number 2 driver. Others say he's just not good enough for a top team. So what's the real truth about the Mexican driver they call the Minister of Defense? Was he really Red Bull material, or just lucky to be in the right place at the right time? What are his weaknesses and strengths? Watch the rest of the video to find out. Back in 2020, Sergio Perez was having dinner with his then Force India team when he got the call that would change his life forever.
Hey Sergio, welcome to Red Bull.
After a decade in Formula 1, most of it spent fighting in the midfield, he was about to join one of the most successful teams in F1 history. But this opportunity came with a catch. He would be teammates with Max Verstappen, a driver who had already seen off Pierre Gasly and Alex Albon in less than 2 years. When Red Bull announced Perez as their new driver, many wondered if they had finally found the answer to their second driver problem. Since Daniel Ricciardo's departure in 2018, the team had struggled to find someone who could not only handle the pressure of a top team, but also work alongside Verstappen. Gasly lasted just 12 races before being sent back to Toro Rosso. Albon managed a bit longer, but still couldn't match Verstappen's pace. The pressure on Perez was immense. He wasn't just fighting for race wins anymore, he was fighting to prove that a 30-year-old midfielder deserved his shot at the big time. But Perez wasn't your typical F1 driver. He was the first Mexican in F1 since the 1980s, forced to leave his family at age 15 to race in Europe. Unlike many F1 drivers who came from wealthy backgrounds or junior driver programs, Perez made it to F1 the hard way, backed by Mexican businesses who believed in his dream. This outsider mentality would serve him well at Red Bull, where he'd need every bit of resilience he'd built up over his career. The question wasn't just whether he could drive fast, it was whether he could survive in a team built around Max Verstappen and prove that his journey to the top wasn't just a lucky break. From being nearly out of F1 to signing with a top team, Perez's path was anything but normal. His F1 career started with Sauber in 2011, where he turned heads by nearly winning his second race in Malaysia, battling with Fernando Alonso in the rain before settling for second place.
Yes, Checo, yes, that's it. Well done. Very good, very good.
This performance caught McLaren's eye, who signed him to replace Lewis Hamilton in 2013. But what seemed like a dream move turned into a nightmare. The McLaren car was terrible and Perez struggled. For the first time in his career, people started questioning if he belonged in F1. McLaren dropped him after just 1 year. Most drivers never recover from being fired by a top team, but Perez wasn't most drivers. He landed at Force India, a midfield team with a tiny budget but big ambition. It was here that Perez earned his nickname, the Tire Whisperer. In an era where most drivers struggled to manage their tires, Perez could make them last longer than anyone else, turning poor qualifying positions into unlikely podiums. Between 2014 and 2019, Perez scored 5 podiums with Force India, more than any other driver outside the top 3 teams. He consistently outperformed his teammates, including beating future race winner Esteban Ocon. But in 2020, everything changed. Force India, now renamed Racing Point, announced they were replacing Perez with Sebastian Vettel for 2021. After 7 years with the team, Perez was out of a drive. Then came the race that changed everything, the 2020 Sakir Grand Prix. Starting from the back after a first lap crash, Perez drove the race of his life. He picked off car after car, managed his tires perfectly, and when Mercedes messed up Lewis Hamilton's pit stop, Perez was there to take advantage. He crossed the finish line first, becoming the first Mexican to win an F1 race in 50 years.
Man who was in last place at the end of lap 1 comes home to win the Sakir Grand Prix.
The win came at the perfect time. Red Bull was watching, and they needed someone who could deliver under pressure. Red Bull had seen enough. They needed an experienced driver who could score points consistently, manage tires well, and handle the pressure of a top team. Just weeks after his win, they announced Perez would join them for 2021. The Mexican who started his career in a midfield Sauber was now partnering Max Verstappen in one of F1's most successful teams. But getting the seat was one thing. Keeping it would be another challenge entirely. Joining Red Bull wasn't like joining any other team. Their cars were known to be tricky to drive, built around Verstappen's aggressive driving style. In fact, the joke in the paddock was that Red Bull didn't build cars, they built Max Verstappen Special. Perez's first few races were a struggle. He qualified 11th in his debut race in Bahrain, while Verstappen fought for the win. The media was already whispering, had Red Bull made another mistake? But Perez had been here before. Just like at Force India, he used his tire management skills to turn poor qualifying positions observations into strong race results. By the fourth race of 2021, he was starting to get comfortable. Then came Azerbaijan. On a chaotic day in Baku, with both title contenders Hamilton and Verstappen out of the race, Perez kept his cool. He held off a charging Lewis Hamilton and took his first win for Red Bull. The celebrations in Mexico City could be heard all the way in Milton Keynes. Yet it wasn't all smooth sailing. While Verstappen was fighting Hamilton for the championship, Perez was expected to play the supporting role. At the Turkish Grand Prix, he put on a defensive masterclass against Hamilton, holding him up for 2 crucial laps. The nickname Minister of Defense was born, and Red Bull had found exactly what they were looking for: a driver who could not only win races but also help their number one when needed. The 2022 season showed even more promise. Perez won the Monaco Grand Prix, F1's most prestigious race, driving perfectly under intense pressure. He even led the championship at one point, something no other Verstappen teammate had ever done. His racecraft was impeccable. In Singapore, he held off Ferrari's Charles Leclerc for 40 laps with worn tires to take another win. But there was a flip side to these successes. In qualifying, Verstappen was usually half a second faster. While Perez could work miracles with tire management in the races, he couldn't match his teammates' raw speed. At Red Bull, this was becoming a familiar story. Good enough to win occasionally, but not quite good enough to challenge Verstappen consistently. The real test came in the races where everything clicked for both drivers. In Saudi Arabia 2022, Perez took his first F1 pole position and led the early laps. But when Verstappen turned up the heat, Perez had no answer. It was a pattern that would repeat. Whenever both Red Bulls were running at their best, Verstappen was always that bit faster, that bit more aggressive, that bit more likely to find the extra tenth when it mattered. What made Perez so valuable to Red Bull wasn't just his ability to win races. It was his unique set of skills that perfectly complemented their strategy. In races where most drivers had to pit twice, Perez could often make a one-stop strategy work. This wasn't just about driving slowly to save tires. He could maintain competitive lap times while making his tires last 5-10 laps longer than anyone else. At tracks like Baku and Monaco, where overtaking is nearly impossible, this tire management turned him into a serious threat. Then there was his defense. Perez earned his Minister of Defense nickname for good reason. His ability to place his car perfectly in battle made him a nightmare to overtake. Perez had a special talent for making his car seem wider than it actually was, without crossing the line into dangerous driving. This defensive skill made him the perfect rear gunner for Red Bull's strategy, especially when Verstappen needed protection from rivals. But Perez's weaknesses were equally clear. His biggest issue was qualifying pace, the kind of raw speed needed to nail one perfect lap. While he could occasionally pull out a spectacular qualifying performance, like his pole in Saudi Arabia, he was usually 3-4 positions behind Verstappen. This meant he often had to fight through the field in races, using up his tires and making his Sunday work much harder than it needed to be. The pressure of a top team also exposed another weakness: consistency. At Force India, a few bad races didn't matter much, but at Red Bull, every mistake was magnified. When things went well, Perez could look like a world champion. But when he lost confidence, like during his difficult streak in mid-2023, he could struggle to even make it out of Q1 in qualifying. The mental pressure of competing at the front seemed to affect him more than it did Verstappen. There was also the matter of car development. While Verstappen could adapt his driving style to whatever the engineers threw at him, Perez often struggled when the car evolved away from his preferences. He needed a stable rear end to perform at his best, and when the car didn't give him that confidence, his performance could drop dramatically. Looking back at Perez's Red Bull journey, you'll get different answers about his success depending on who you ask. Team boss Christian Horner calls him the best teammate Verstappen has ever had, while critics point to the massive gap between the two drivers in 2023. But maybe both views miss the real story of Sergio Perez. Unlike previous Red Bull second drivers who crumbled under pressure, Perez carved out his own identity. He wasn't trying to beat Verstappen, he was trying to be the perfect supporting actor in Red Bull's show. When you compare him to other successful number 2 drivers like Barrichello at Ferrari or Bottas at Mercedes, Perez stands out. He won races on merit, not just when his teammate had problems. His victories at Monaco and Singapore weren't gifted to him, he earned them with skill and nerve. For Mexican motorsport, Perez's impact goes far beyond his race results. He became the country's most successful F1 driver ever, breaking a 50-year win drought. Every race weekend, the grandstands fill with Mexican flags. He proved that you don't need to come from Europe's racing schools to succeed in F1. Perhaps the best way to judge Perez's Red Bull career comes from something Niki Lauda once said: "A good driver can win races, but it takes a great driver to help their team win championship." By this measure, Perez did exactly what Red Bull needed. He wasn't the fastest driver on the grid, but he was exactly the teammate they needed during their return to dominance. The lasting image of Perez won't be his occasional struggles against Verstappen, but rather those brilliant days when everything clicked, defending like a lion in Turkey, mastering the streets of Monaco, or celebrating with his team after another Red Bull 1-2 finish. In the end, Perez proved that being a successful F1 driver isn't always about being the fastest. Sometimes it's about knowing exactly what role you need to play.